Today we're diving into one of the longest and most heated conflicts in the Western Hemisphere, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela. What started as cautious cooperation decades ago has spiraled into sanctions, regime change attempts, and a battle over democracy, oil, and influence. To truly understand why Washington and Caracas remain at odds, we need to trace the story from Venezuela's rise as an oil power in the 20th century through the political revolution under Hugo Chavez to Nicolas Maduro's contested presidency, and finally to how this conflict affects the wider world today. The US-Venezuela relationship wasn't always adversarial. In the early and mid-20th century, Venezuela was seen as one of Washington's key allies in South America, largely because of its vast oil reserves. American companies like Exxon and Chevron were heavily invested in Venezuelan oil fields, and the profits flowed both ways. For decades, Venezuela was relatively stable compared to many of its neighbours, and US policymakers valued that stability in the context of the Cold War. At the same time, Venezuela was deeply dependent on oil exports, meaning the health of its economy was tied directly to US demand. But cracks began to appear. The global oil shocks of the 1970s encouraged Venezuela to nationalize its oil industry, giving more control to the state and less to foreign companies. While Venezuela remained an oil partner, the seeds of future tensions had been planted: resource nationalism, anti-imperialist rhetoric, and the idea that Washington's influence over Latin America was something to be resisted. The real turning point came in 1998, when Hugo Chavez, a former paratrooper who had once led a failed coup, was elected president. Chavez campaigned on promises of social justice, redistribution of wealth, and independence from US domination. He called his political project the Bolivarian Revolution, inspired by independence leader Simon Bolivar. From the beginning, Chavez's policies clashed with US interests. He tightened state control over the oil sector, redirected profits into massive social programs, and openly criticized US foreign policy. He opposed the Iraq War, strengthened ties with Cuba, and presented himself as a leader of a new leftist wave, sweeping Latin America. Washington's reaction was swift and increasingly hostile. In 2002, Chavez faced a short-lived coup that temporarily removed him from power. Evidence later suggested elements within the US government at least had knowledge of it, if not involvement, in the coup plot. Although Chavez was restored to power within days by massive popular protests, the episode deepened his mistrust of Washington and cemented his narrative that the US was actively trying to destroy his revolution. Chavez used high oil prices in the 2000s to fund ambitious social programs aimed at reducing poverty, improving healthcare, and expanding education. These policies won him widespread support at home and admiration abroad, especially among critics of US foreign policy. He also used oil as a tool of democracy, offering cheap fuel to allies in the Caribbean and even providing discounted heating oil to poor communities in the United States. At the same time, Chavez expanded Venezuela's alliances with countries like Russia, China, and Iran. These partnerships were not only economic but also symbolic, demonstrating that Venezuela could chart an independent course outside of US influence. Chavez became a frequent critic of US imperialism on the world stage, making fiery speeches at the United Nations and building his reputation as a defiant figure. The US, in turn, increasingly painted Chavez as an authoritarian. Washington criticized his consolidation of power, restrictions on media, and alleged corruption. By the time of Chavez's death in 2013, relations between the US and Venezuela had deteriorated significantly, setting the stage for an even more contentious period under his successor. When Nicolas Maduro, Chavez's chosen successor, assumed the presidency in 2013, Venezuela was already facing economic headwinds, cutting off the government's main source of revenue. Corruption and mismanagement worsened the crisis, leading to shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation, and millions of Venezuelans began fleeing the country in what became one of the largest migration crises in the Americas. The United States responded with increasingly aggressive measures. Under President Donald Trump, sanctions were expanded dramatically, targeting key Venezuelan officials, financial institutions, and eventually the state-run oil company. The goal was to isolate the Maduro government and pressure him into stepping down. In 2019, the conflict reached a peak when opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself as interim president, citing constitutional provisions after disputed elections. The US and dozens of other countries recognized Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate leader. Maduro, however, maintained control of the military and state institutions, and with support from Russia, China, and Cuba, he weathered the challenge. The result was a tense stalemate, with Washington and its allies backing Guaido, while much of the rest of the world dealt pragmatically with Maduro. Beyond the politics, the US-Venezuela conflict has had devastating consequences for ordinary Venezuelans. Sanctions, corruption, and economic collapse combined to create widespread suffering. By the early 2020s, the United Nations estimated that more than 7 million Venezuelans had left the country, seeking refuge in Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and beyond. Inside Venezuela, shortages of food and medicine became common, and public services like electricity and healthcare crumbled. Critics of US policy argued that sanctions made the crisis worse, punishing ordinary people more than the government. Supporters counter that the sanctions were necessary to pressure a regime accused of human rights abuses and electoral fraud. The debate over the humanitarian impact of sanctions remains one of the most controversial aspects of the US-Venezuela conflict. At its core, much of the conflict between Washington and Caracas revolves around oil. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet its production has collapsed due to years of mismanagement and sanctions. For the United States, Venezuelan oil once provided a stable source of imports, but in the current era, the issue is less about access and more about influence. Russia and China have stepped in to fill the void, providing loans, investment, and political support to Caracas. This has transformed the US-Venezuela conflict into part of a larger global struggle, where Venezuela becomes a pawn in the competition between Washington and its geopolitical rivals. The result is that Venezuela, once seen as simply a Latin American issue, is now entangled in global debates over power, sovereignty, and resources. Over the years, there have been repeated attempts at dialogue, often brokered by international actors like Norway or the Vatican. These talks have focused on humanitarian aid, electoral reform, and sanctions relief. However, they have rarely produced lasting results, as both Maduro and the US have remained deeply entrenched in their positions. More recently, global events such as the war in Ukraine and rising oil prices have reshaped the calculus. As the US looked for alternative energy sources to reduce dependence on Russian oil, some of Washington began reconsidering engagement with Venezuela. Quiet meetings between US officials and Maduro's government suggested that pragmatism might eventually soften hardline positions. Yet mistrust remains deep, and the political cost of appearing to legitimize Maduro remains high in American domestic politics. The US-Venezuela conflict is not just about two governments at odds. It reflects deeper questions about sovereignty, democracy, and the future of Latin America. Venezuela represents a resistance to US imperialism and the possibility of an independent path for the region. For critics, it represents authoritarianism, economic collapse, and the dangers of populism. For the US, the conflict has revealed the limits of its influence. Despite years of sanctions and diplomatic pressure, Maduro remains in power. For Venezuela, the conflict has left scars on its economy, its institutions, and its people. The migration crises and the collapse of public services will shape the country's trajectory for decades to come. The US-Venezuela conflict is a story of oil and ideology, of power struggles and human suffering. It shows how the choices of leaders in Washington and Caracas ripple outwards, affecting millions of ordinary lives. It also reminds us that international conflicts are rarely black and white. Sanctions meant to pressure a government can hurt a population. Revolutionary ideals meant to uplift the poor can morph into authoritarian rule. As of today, the US-Venezuela conflict remains unsolved. Maduro holds on to power, Washington continues to debate its strategy, and Venezuelans themselves remain caught in the middle. Whether the future brings reconciliation, continued confrontation, or unexpected shifts, one thing is clear. This conflict is one of the defining stories of Latin America in the 21st century.